afternoon, folks. Today I have come to Stone Barrow. It's a National Trust property here in the southwest of the UK. It's again on the Jurassic coastline, so it's just a little bit down the road from Lyme Regis, was where I was the other day, and it's another beautiful, gloriously sunny day. It's not even summer yet here in the UK. It's spring. It's kind of mid-May. The next few days are supposed to be just amazing, and today is just an amazing day as well. I'm currently outside the Crazy Cow. There you go, Crazy Cow, which is the National Trust refreshment place here, and just generally around here in Stone Barrow. Oh, by the way, a barrow is Old English term for a burial ground, and I think back in the Bronze Age it used to be a burial ground, but with the erosion from the sea and stuff like that, the burial part has long since been washed away, let's put it that way. But it just has a tremendous vibe around here. You can see the scenery, it's beautiful from what you can see at the moment, and I'll be showing you more as I go. And it's that vibe that I wanted to talk about. Well, not specifically the vibe for Stone Barrow, but something called vibe coding, which is something new that I've come across, and I'm going to tell you more all about it. And along the way, by the powers of kind of editing magic, I'm going to show you how I vibe coded a authentication workflow into a Next.js application using Authorization code flow. I've just been to the shop and got a Twix because I thought something chocolatey would be good. Yeah, vibe coding. What is vibe coding? Have you ever heard about vibe coding before, or are you like me in that it's only something recent? So it is something that's fairly recent, I guess, because it's all about writing software with the aid of AI. And AI as we know it today, generative AI as it's otherwise known, is something relatively new. So vibe coding is all about using AI to actually write software, and that might be whole applications, maybe a bit ambitious, and not what I'm going to be showing you today. So this little video has got an accompanying article that I wrote on my blog, which is Discover CIAM, and you can read along with that or just listen to me as I ramble on at the moment, and I'll also be adding, like I say, some snippets of code in here to show you what I've been doing so you can view those. But I'll put a link to the associated article in the comments associated with this video, and you can follow along together, like both things at the same time. I don't know if you can see in the background there, but I've just come past a herd of cows who are just chilling and vibing under a tree. So there you go. This is a great place to talk about vibe coding. So I put a link in my article on my blog to a recent video session that an ex-colleague of mine did, which actually introduced me more to vibe coding than anything else has. And in that session that he did, which is in a series of kind of video live coding sessions that he does, Juan, who's the name of my colleague, or my ex-colleague, actually did a little exercise in vibe coding an entire application. And there were some interesting outcomes. I think a lot of that was due to the fact that, when I say interesting, maybe challenging is the right word. And he got like a significant way. And AI did a relatively good job. It wasn't like it was appallingly bad at it. But there's a very specific way these days to use AI, which is effectively to be very precise about what you want and provide as much context as possible. And I use AI quite a bit in producing the articles and some of this content that I produce. I won't say AI writes it for me, but it certainly gives me ideas and a sounding board, which I think is a really useful use of AI, especially in the industry that I talk a lot about, which is customer identity and access management. And the reason for that is that AI works best, generative AI works best by having content, obviously, that it can pull and infer from. And in an industry or in a space where there's a lot of content, but that content might not be curated or canonical, then it becomes a challenge for AI to know what's correct and what isn't. And it isn't because people are producing stuff that's incorrect. It's that customer identity and access management is an industry or an area, I should say, where changes happen quite rapidly. And that's not to say they happen every day, but changes happen in response to the threat landscape, and the threat landscape changes on a regular basis. So it's difficult to have constantly curated and canonical content that's up to date with the best practices, the latest best practices and the latest standards. So having watched Juan's live coding session, I kind of thought to myself, well, I don't really want to code an entire application per se, but I am building some CIAM integration from a B2B SaaS perspective, and let me just give you a shot of the sea. So there was this good opportunity to test this out. So what I'm going to do is create a simple Next.js application, which is easy to do. Next.js has become quite a popular choice for building web applications, and I'm going to simply let AI integrate identity and access management from an authentication perspective. And I'm going to be using Visual Studio, and maybe like most people do, I don't know. I wouldn't say most people, but a lot of developers use Visual Studio. And I'm going to be using Copilot, which is Visual Studio's integrated AI assistant. Let's put it that way. It's probably the easiest way to do it. Do you know, walking and talking is quite interesting, and it takes a lot of concentration. I had to stop here for just a bit and show you it's just beautiful, the view. So once into Visual Studio Code, you can then start a chat with Copilot. Now, Copilot chats are context specific. So the interesting thing about the chat in Copilot is that the requests, let's put it that way, that you make to Copilot leverage an LLM, a large language model, and here I'm using GPT-4.1. So it's the same kind of language model behind ChatGPT and the ChatGPT dashboard and interface that you would typically interact with via the ChatGPT website. I can configure other models to Copilot, and those are typically premium models, so I would be charged for using them, whereas this is free tier, free number of queries, free number of kind of code updates, code changes, and you'll see how me asking or me requesting from Copilot actually, as it's integrated with Visual Studio Code, makes changes to the code for me. So I'm going to start off by asking it to create a OIDC authentication integration for the application that I've built. And if you're following along in this, or following along with my article in this, you'll see where I make some comments about giving it context by selecting files, but also giving it context by being specific about what I want it to create. Now, I am being specific about version of Next.js because versions of Next.js which were predominantly client-side rendering by default, and some versions were server-side rendering by default. And you'll see how its first pass has made some attempts to identify that based on the version of Next.js that I've said I'm using, but how I've had to add some additional context to improve it and get Vibe or get AI via Vibe coding to actually make some updates and changes for me by prompting it with additional prompts. So this is the first prompt, and you'll see, and I'm going to accept the changes that it's made to the code and let it go through and do that. Okay, so as you can see, Vibe, or Copilot I should say, has made a number of suggestions and I've accepted those, and by and large not too bad, but we have a few problems. So the first problem that we have is with regards to the providers that are being used from a NextAuth.js perspective. So let's just take a pause there. NextAuth.js, that's a library, it's an SDK that is relatively new. Again, everything is kind of relatively recent, I suppose, with a lot of this stuff. But it has nothing to do with vibe coding, nothing to do with AI, but it is a client-side or a JavaScript related authentication library or an authentication SDK that you can get that attempts to follow best practices and the most recent set of standards. Now, depending on who you're using as your authentication provider or your IDP, identity provider, whether you're using, as I am, Keycloak in a DIY deploy it yourself solution, or whether you're using a third-party SaaS vendor, you may find that the vendor has SDKs in their own right. And, you know, some of those, they work really well. Some of them have had challenges over the years. Maybe some more have had challenges recently. You can read more about that in the accompanying article with this video. So Copilot has recommended using NextAuth.js as a library. And interestingly, with AI, generative AI, it is by and large non-deterministic. So it's a bit like asking a human a question. It will effectively come back with slight variations in answers depending upon when you're asking the question or subsequent questions of the same ilk that you ask. And in fact, you could ask exactly the same question more than once and it may come back with a slightly different response. But by and large, whenever I've been playing around with this or was doing some early prototyping on this, it always came back and suggested using the NextAuth.js library for a Next.js application. So I'm using that. And there's configuration issue with the providers, because by default it doesn't know what provider I'm using. I didn't actually tell it. It gave me some suggestions, so Copilot gave me some suggestions, but it didn't know I was using Keycloak. So now let me go ahead and tell it that I'm specifically want it to update for using Keycloak. Now, as you can see, it does a pretty good job. It doesn't do a 100% job, and there is some manual intervention that I've done here. I could have kept on prompting it, I'm sure, but you know, vibe coding, I feel, is all about kind of working in partnership with the AI. So I'm not trying to get the AI to do everything. I use my own skills and my own abilities, and I can, you know, use the documentation from NextAuth.js, and I can use Vibe to help me, and I can help it. So it's collaborative. So I'm going to tell it, I've told it that I'm using Keycloak, and so it's made some updates. I've augmented those updates, and that's the first problem I fixed with AI, and that's great. There are some more problems. I list them out in my accompanying article and go into more detail there, but I've also needed to make some adjustments from a perspective that it has done most of the job for server-side rendering, but it's got some client-side rendering components in there as well that Next.js and the Next.js runtime kind of whinges about. So I've in part made some changes manually, but from the client server-side rendering perspective, I've actually asked the AI to make those changes, and I think it's done a pretty good job. I've come off the National Trust path to try and drop down through the coastal path. Anyway, as I'm wandering through here, let's talk you through a little bit about the Keycloak configuration. So I have chosen to do a DIY, deploy it yourself, Keycloak installation, and using Keycloak as my IDP. I'm self-hosting Keycloak, and I'm doing it in a manner that I've talked about in previous articles, and I'll be talking about in more detail in some future articles as well. The solution that I've chosen, or the way I've chose to deploy Keycloak, means that I can employ some security practices that may not be easily available if you are using a hosted third-party solution. So for example, I set Keycloak up so that the management interface for Keycloak, which is independent of the interface for OpenID Connect and OAuth2 for generating tokens and SAML interface for generating SAML assertions. I've put access to the management interface behind my firewall. So although it's exposed via an HTTP, or in my case an HTTPS interface, and using secure sockets layer or transport layer security is something I'll talk about in a future article, but highly recommended. Because it's behind the firewall, it means that although it's on the internet, access is only available from a management perspective from my corporate domain, let's put it that way. Anyway, I'm not going to talk much more about that. That's for a future article, but let me show you how I've configured my client definition in Keycloak following the recommendation provided by Copilot. So I asked Copilot, Copilot actually asked me if I wanted to get more help from it about setting up my Keycloak. And So later on in the conversation that I had with a Copilot, I leveraged the context that had already been generated based on the prompts and the information I'd supplied, and now ask Copilot to configure or show me how to configure Keycloak, and it obliged. And you can see I didn't have to, from a contextual point of view, I don't have to go back over what I'd already said. It knew the conversation. So it's not something that you have to do all in one go, and really illustrates how you can progressively leverage AI in a vibe coding scenario. So Keycloak here is acting as the IDP. So it's an application independent identity provider, and you can read more about the configurations I've made and everything else in the article that is associated with this video. National trust properties often go through farmland that's used here in the UK for a commercial basis, and you often see signs like this, which tells you about sort of cows and bulls and how to be careful. And of course, if you are going across land that's in use, you always need to close the gate. That's the countryside code, as it used to be called. I don't know what it's called these days, but I don't know if it has an official name. I think this is probably one of my favourite things about the English countryside, especially here in Dorset. I'm just going past this, get a better picture of it, but get a better view on it. Past this babbling brook. There you go. It's literally just in the middle of this meadow. I've come down some steps, going up some steps, and I'll go back up to the coastal path. But I just wanted to show you that. So in the background there, you can see what is colloquially, I think, referred to as St Gilda's Beach. And I'll show you the chapel, or the ruins of the chapel, in a moment. I've just come from there. It's quite a taxing slog. That's the remainder of the way to Golden Cap. I'm not going to go all the way to the top of Golden Cap then. We'll stop just up here. Brought some lunch with me, and it's coming towards late afternoon, so I'm going to stop and have a bite to eat. Then, as we go down to St Gilda's, I'll show you the entire authorization code line. There's the view from where I have my lunch. I've packed up, leave no trace in the countryside, as they say. And I'm going to head down towards St Gilda's now, or St Gabriel's. I think I keep been calling it St Gilda's, but it's St Gabriel's. And the chapel, or the ruins of the chapel. So this is the ruin of St Gabriel's Chapel. Now, I'm not really sure who St Gabriel was. It's a bit precarious around here. From a footing perspective, it's very uneven, but I'll try and walk and talk at the same time. It is a walk and talk series after all. You can go in. Now, I'm not really sure who St Gabriel was, but I'll see if I can find some details and maybe a link to somewhere that I can share with you. But this is the ruined chapel of St Gabriel's. Not much left of it now, and I'm not sure I would have liked to have lived here. Yeah, I think it's a bit primitive, but there we go. Certainly no electricity, no internet, no need for authentication via authorization code flow, but probably authentication maybe using user ID and password if there was a kind of like a need to know who somebody was who came to visit. Anyway, yes, passwords do go back that long. And that brings me on quite nicely, really, to illustrating the authorization code flow implementation. A couple of things. Firstly, I'm using a SSO type approach that is predominantly, in fact, completely centric around social authentication. And I wrote an article about, or maybe not just a single article, but maybe it is worth writing an article just on that, but mentioned in a couple of places, and I'll link to the SSO document or the SSO article that I wrote, which describes why using social authentication can be very, very useful from supporting a user ID and password perspective, not just for getting additional information about a user and building a user's profile, especially if you're doing a DIY approach like I am to a CIAM integration. The other thing you'll notice is because, and it's not directly as a result of, but it is a best practice for SSO, I'm using outer account linking. And actually I'm using the out-of-box account linking provided by Keycloak, which has some things I'd like to change about it, let's put it that way. I wouldn't say it's massively insecure, but it has some things I'd like to change about it. And I'll be sharing those in a future video with probably an accompanying article and everything else as well. But those two things really allow me to leverage the full scope of capabilities using those social authenticators, those authenticators that support OpenID Connect or OAuth 2, to effectively offload a lot of the work that comes as a result, really, of user ID password authentication and the kind of thing that you end up paying for with a third-party CIAM solution, and also the kind of thing that you will probably, more than likely, has the potential to cost you a lot of money if you do it, if you support user ID and password authentication in a DIY approach to CIAM. So those are two of the things that are illustrative there. There's a couple of interesting things I'm going to leave you with, actually, that are kind of follow-up exercises that I'm going to leave you to do, and you can read more about those in the associated article that I have with this video. And they're really changing some of the out-of-box features or the out-of-box functions that come with Next.js and NextAuth.js and that SDK. So I'm going to leave you with those. So for now, thanks for coming with me today. It's been just a beautiful day out here. And the next one, I promise I will do another video at Golden Cap. We'll say goodbye for now to St. Gabriel's Chapel. I think it's St. Gabriel's Chapel. And then I'll do my next video or a future video very soon from Golden Cap. I'll come to it from a different direction. You can get to Golden Cap in a different direction. But for now, happy coding and integrating with CIAM. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.